Welcome to the Media Roundtable, special edition, where we dive into the secret of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of the Chief Audio Officer, marketers responsible for the success of their audio program. It's a narrow lane, but that's what's great about podcasts. I'm your host, Giles Martin, EVP of Strategy and Insights at Oxford Road. And today I'm joined by Bryan Barletta, partner and founder, I believe, at Sounds Profitable.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you so much.
Great to have you here. And also Pete Birsinger, CEO and founder of Podscribe.
Excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, Miranda Romano, VP of Operations at Oxford Road.
Wow.
And today we're talking about downloads. The title officially is What is a Download, which you would think would be a relatively straightforward question. And in certain media channels, arguably it is. But in podcasts, it's historically been a lot more challenging than a lot of other media channels. And there have been some really interesting developments in the market in the last month or two, particularly around some great work that our partners here, Bryan and Pete, have been closely involved in. So we wanted to bring that to your attention today, if it hasn't already been top of mind for you, and give these two fine gentlemen an opportunity to talk about what they've been doing and how they see the future of this topic in this industry. Now, just by way of a little introduction, and then I do want to hand it over to the experts to give a bit more detail here. But this question about what is a download in podcasts, I mean, I joined the industry in 2018, and I believe that the sort of industry standard guidelines issued by the IAB, at least the 2.0 version, was published shortly before that. I think it was December 2017, when they published their initial guidelines on how to measure a download. And you might think, why is this a problematic or challenging question? And one of the reasons for that is the amount of podcasting that's listened to and consumed on mobile devices. And when people are on the move, the files that are a download to those devices are download in different chunks typically, because some of those files for an hour-long episode can be relatively large size, not as large as a video file, but can be significant. And when normally an ad is served in one go, on a traditional digital ad server, but when audio files are downloaded in different pieces to a device, and also that device is potentially moving around a city, say, perhaps connecting to different cell towers and gathering different IP addresses on its way, it can be difficult to cleanly evaluate what one download counts as. And Bryan, you may have been in the industry even before I was in 2018 and may have some more historical perspective on this, but I think a lot of publishers back in the day were, some of them were perhaps counting all the downloads that came in on a day. Some of them were counting every single time a little packet has been delivered to a mobile phone as a download. And there was a lot of discrepancy in terms of how people were doing it. And that is how the IAB and how and why the IAB guidelines were introduced. So let me pause there for a second and invite anyone else to weigh in with any more perspective on this or any more detail that you think I've missed out.
So the thing that I like to highlight the most is that the V2 spec was 2017 for public comment. I think it was 2018 when it was fully made live. The big change between the V1 and V2 spec was the window that we allow something to be considered net new. I think it was 5 minutes for the original V1, and then it was 24 hours rolling for V2. That's a big difference, right? Numbers dropped substantially for that. Podcasting as an industry, all the major hosting platforms came together because they were frustrated because nobody was counting it the same way. So a lot of the hosts got together, especially when advertising started to further pick up and we needed more credibility. They actually went to the MRC first and said, hey, can we build a spec with you? And they said no. So that's why we're home with the IAB, and it's part of the IAB Tech Lab, but it stands out because the IAB Tech Lab doesn't do the official download, which is the closest thing we have to impressions in podcasting. They don't do that in any other field, right? They don't do that in video and display and in retail media, right? That's usually the permit of MRC. IAB works with them. it's a headache there. And now when podcasting did start, I mean, we didn't have iPhones. It's been 20 years, right? So the technology has changed a little bit. Today, it's important to remember that a download just means it's what we get to see, because what it is when you press play on a device, it's whether it's your computer, your phone, whatever, it's saying, give me this episode because this person wants to listen to it. Now, certain players, like I believe the Spotify app, will say, give me the whole thing. Doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or 3 hours, right? They just want that file as fast as possible because they don't want to interrupt that listener. So it can be less connections there. The Apple Podcast app and a few others, and Pete can probably speak to this a little bit better, sometimes ask for it in chunks. And so what a download says for us is the request was substantial enough that we did send from the hosting platform 60 seconds of audio. And that's important to highlight because you can have a 25 megabyte image at the beginning of that file, that in the header data, right? The ID3 tag, that you don't want to count as part of a download. You need to wait until there was audio. So listening intent, actually playing. And the reason that we focus on downloads isn't something altruistic or anything. It's that because we're an open platform, none of these apps have to be certified. None of these apps have to follow any guidelines. And in fact, we play whack-a-mole pretty often as an industry to catch up with them. So what I will say is that where we are now is progressive downloading, which is what we're doing, right, is super common. If you open up the Netflix app on your computer, your phone, and you kill the internet a minute into it, you'll still play for another minute and a half. That's all this is, right? It's caching the content and preparing for it. Where podcasting really stands out is that the ads are built into that content, whereas in other media like Netflix and Hulu and anything streaming, the only difference is that when the ad break happens, the app, the client side version of it, makes a call for the ad in real time. And that's just something that podcasting doesn't have. And for those people who say that Spotify has it, absolutely. Spotify has in-app audio advertising with what they call streaming ad insertion. We're here to talk about podcast advertising, which is all based around the download.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Sorry, Pete, I'll give you a sec to jump in a second. In our original notes, we had topic of us commenting about, what is a download? Is it the same as an impression, et cetera, et cetera? And, we're typically at pains to point out to our clients, because it's very different from how other media is handled, that no, a download is not an impression at all. And it's no guarantee that somebody has been exposed to an ad. But that streaming ad insertion from Spotify is one of the few, maybe the only, I'm not sure what you guys would probably know better than me, but areas where I believe we actually can legitimately consider it an impression.
In the same way that you can consider an entirely siloed, unmeasured. So it's like how it's saying that Facebook and YouTube, right? Their measurement it's a black box. You trust them. They can fire the pixel on their servers and forward the information for you. But it is not an open standard. It's not certified and verified. And you mentioned impressions, and I just want to say in the IAB spec, impression isn't part of it. Ad delivery is what we call it. And so when you're doing a baked in ad or integrated ad, which we really should move terminology for, the 60-second download counts wherever the ad is, because there's no dynamic ad insertion. Dynamic ad insertion adds a little bit of pressure on there by saying the portion of the episode that contained the ad was received and the episode that it is in is counts as a valid download. So that gives you two levels of validation on there that makes it more accurate. But now, as we reduce the issues that we're seeing with auto downloads or removing the likelihood that people are downloading and not listening, we're getting closer. We just can't figure out completion rate yet.
Pete, I want to give you an opportunity to say something. I know you're going to weigh in. I hope we haven't lost the moment.
No, I think you guys said it very well. The only thing, to just put it maybe as bluntly as I could, the reason downloads are the currency in podcasting is because we don't know if people actually listened. So the best we can do, as Bryan said, is go for listening intent with the downloads. So the IAB in their standard tries to synchronize, a download definition is, something that meets X probability of a listen, where they have listening intent. So Giles, you were saying, at first a download, the IAB standards are needed to standardize because some people counted this, some people counted that. But I think too, even additionally, some people there were at first, Bryan could probably give the history better, but there was a time at first Apple Watch downloads would be counted, and maybe everybody was counting them the same, but then people realized there's not a lot of listening intent there. So I think the spec also updates, even if it's like everybody counts it the same, it's, well, which of these quote unquote downloads may not be getting actually a lot of listens.
Yeah, the Apple Watch one's really interesting because what we saw was that it was likely the same user and the both apps were downloading the same thing, and so it was duplicative, right? So it was just determining that the Apple Watch wasn't considered a standalone and we'd make a call there. And that was an example where the IAB moved faster than Apple. Apple has since made changes on their end so that it doesn't show up for both, I believe. But we had already updated the specs so that we would remove that. And it was positive. We came to that really quickly.
I just going to end this section with just one little call out, which relates to a bit more sort of media planning and thinking generally is, sometimes when clients become aware of this and they're like, oh, so all of these impressions that I thought I was buying, like actually they're not impressions. Like how many impressions am I actually getting relative to the downloads, like 75%, 50%, 2/3. And of course, we don't typically have good data on that. And they can be quite concerned, understandably, when they find out. And then there's a couple of things I say to them. I mean, one, the easy one is, well, this is a performance focus typically for our clients. And if the impression delivery is, minus 20% or minus 40%, if you're getting the response, ultimately you can focus on that. But I think with regard to other media, it's also true in a way of other channels. And you think about the amount of wastage that happens on TV advertising, for example. And it's like maybe you pay for 1 million impressions, but, I'm in the kitchen making a cup of tea or staring at my tablet, or, I'm in the other room, and those impressions aren't really being served. Like no one's really listening to them. Like they're being downloaded in a way. And so it does have parallels in other channels. And I just think that that's quite interesting. And if anyone has any final comments on that, I invite those before we move on.
The hard part there is that it makes us feel defensive talking about it. One of the things that I saw at Podcast Movement over the summer was such a confidence in the download this year versus the year before. Like, I think I could have convinced anybody like a made up definition of the download the year before, because we're all kind of insecure, right? We're at the bust point of a little bubble that we had, but we're still, like, without that boom and bust, like we're still on an upward trajectory, which is amazing. But the thing that I really want to highlight is, like, let's say that people are like, there's no major podcasts out there that everybody drops off at 50%. Because if everybody's consistently leaving the back half of it, they'll stop listening to it. If they stop listening to it, it stops downloading. Even if they're auto downloading on Apple, it expires after 15 days or one of the last 5 episodes. So, like, if it's not worth listening to all of it, the downloads decrease. And if it's not an auto download, that means someone hit play with intent on it and went out of their way to listen to it. People are not abandoning shows with the last quarter of it and not finishing it. When they finish it versus when the ad deliver is counted, that can be a little bit different sometimes. There's a handful of shows I come back 3 or 4 days later to. But I think overall, it's really important to remember that, like, this metric it's not just close enough, it's pretty accurate. Like, we've ironed it down, and you can see that by using attribution solutions like Podscribe and others, because those shows that do look in Apple Podcasts or Spotify and see their completion rates are really high for listen through, which are app stats and not generally available, they're also seeing high conversion rates.
Well, I think that the point about intent generally is a really great one that you guys raise. With that, let's move on to this more recent news, Bryan, that you and Pete have both been very heavily involved in. Can you, for the audience, give us a brief synopsis of the changes that have been made on Apple Podcasts as a result of this work? And we're also interested, I mean, this issue obviously exists with Apple. Could it affect other players in the same way or similar ways? And if so, is there continuing work being done in the industry to address that? And what can be done to make that change, ubiquitous across the industry?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is that the open nature of the industry makes it really tough, right? We like to rally around the IAB spec because it adds some credibility to things, but the frequency in which you need to get recertified, the lack of process that we have right now for like prefix pixels being like a full certification instead of like a one with approval, the lack of teeth on some of the things that we could do on there make it a little bit tough. And we have a handful of companies in the space that you guys buy from and others do with confidence still that are not IAB certified. They haven't gone through that process and paid to be audited, but they're compliant and their numbers when matched against the third party are close enough. So the hard part here is that these standards, even for us on our end, which we're touting, we're getting better. More and more people are applying them, but it's still not 100%. When we switch to the other side on the players, the Wild West, right? We've had to make changes and make assumptions based on how each app calls for a little bit of information, which isn't a download, but it's them scraping to identify what's going on with the show and get that data locally, right? Apple makes like the 2 byte request for everybody's device, basically to identify like the information about the show, so it's accessible and they can see it in their device. We had to filter all of that out. So today, Apple Podcasts is the largest podcast player that does auto downloads. I know Overcast does as well, but let's be honest, with the world and the way things are going in podcasting, Overcast is very much like a wave one podcast app. It's very cool for the people who are like really invested in podcasting as a medium. That's not who we're attracting now, right? It was the medium, then it was shows, now it's episodes. So the people we're getting now are coming in through Apple Podcasts, through Spotify, Amazon Music, even YouTube, all of these other places then going and getting a unique app. Apple Podcasts being the primary one doing auto downloads, I don't think that this issue that was identified by Pete is going to be, it's not going to be something that we're going to be able to dig out and replicate and reduce elsewhere. There are a few similar issues that we're seeing in other podcast apps like Spotify and Amazon Music that we've seen that we've addressed and identified to them, but they're way smaller, way more fringe, way less concerning on that, way easier to detect and remove. This specific issue has been known for about 2 years. The problem is that it was being represented and brought to Apple by different hosting platforms and publishers in different ways. And Apple received that information, but they couldn't combine it, really. They couldn't narrow in on it. Pete brought this data to me, incredibly eye-opening data. And I think, honestly, I made him spend 6 hours with me in a food court, and a very, very patient pregnant wife of his. It was a nice Texas food court. It was outside. We made sure she had plenty of lemonade. But we spent 6 hours trying to poke holes in it. We tried to find every way to discredit what we were looking at because we knew that what we were looking at, we're entering Q2 at that time, or Q3 at that time. These are things that, you really want to make sure. We don't want to cause any panic or concern. What we identified was there was a behavior in the Apple Podcast app when it came to people coming back to a show that they previously subscribed to. So we presented it to Apple over the summer. They said they'd look into it to the best of their ability, but they really wanted us to focus on listens, which is an app stat just for them that is not validated externally. And that's really frustrating. We can't pull it into our hosting platforms. You can't measure ads off of it. We brought it to the IAB. It took almost 2 months to get that conversation spun up. But what I will say is that Pete, Acast, a handful of other partners were really clear in sharing data, NPR as well, sharing data to help identify the issue and further corroborate it. And then Apple let us know that they made a change on it when iOS 17 came out. And basically that change, the primary change here is, let's say I fell off of listening to a show at episode 100 and I came back at episode 300. Previously, when I turned on auto download, it would assume every episode that I didn't manually play between episode 100 and 300, I really wanted to download right then and there. So it would immediately try and download 200 episodes, add in some issues with the app being overzealous and the operating system shutting it down. That 200 downloads would happen not only once, but it would happen over multiple days as the app was trying to download it. And it would catch campaigns and it would catch other things in these whirlwinds of older episodes. So Pete's unique perspective in the way that they monitor ad delivery was able to pinpoint it so accurately that we could really help Apple get to the results of it. And it was an interesting and trying process.
Well, and I do. You've answered some of my questions already, but I'm going to keep poking a little bit for more detail in a minute. But Pete, if we could turn to you just for a sec, could you give us a bit more background on the specific issues you saw that sort of caught your eye. How did you uncover it, and what did you do on your end? How long was that investigation before you reached out to Bryan?
Yeah, I could give a bit more of the backstory, and two, for some parallels or for ways of looking at it that I think can still highlight some other possible issues that may come up or maybe are happening now. But like Bryan said, I think I had been looking at it for a while internally with the team, and I thought for the longest time we were doing something wrong. I thought it didn't make sense. It seemed like the results were a little bit too outrageous, and what the results were, I think maybe a lot of people have seen a frequency graph where it shows for listeners of a campaign what percent of the listeners were exposed to one ad, what percent of the listeners were exposed to two ads at frequency 2, 3 ads, and so on. And I think that graph has been around in the industry before, that frequency graph, to know roughly what frequency profile you're hitting your listeners at. But the only slight tweak we made to it was put also what percent of impressions were going to listeners at each frequency level. So then you can see, well, okay, maybe 70% of listeners had frequency 1, but that might have only been 40% of the impressions. Similarly, maybe at frequency level 15, it was 1% of listeners. But if, say, you, Giles, here, if everyone on this call or podcast downloads a podcast one time, but you download it 10 times, well, you're going to have 70, 80, whatever percent of the impressions, even though 3/4 of us are only going to have frequency 1. So then putting it in that perspective, we started to see, wait a minute, maybe a decent sized chunk of these impressions are going to a small percent of listeners. But the trouble in podcasting is that IP is not a perfect indicator. At best, it's a mediocre indicator that can still change here and there. So what we thought it was, and what everybody, at first we mentioned it to, said, oh, this is probably just noisy IPs. This might be people on an airplane or at Times Square, where it looks like the same people are downloading the episode. The same person is doing it 100 times, but there's really a lot of people behind it. So that's what we thought for the longest time. And I could share some of the reasons why we didn't think that, but that was a bit of, at least the start of the process that sort of piqued our interest.
And when did you start to sort of see the light, as it were?
Well, I'm kind of interested in the event since you brought it up.
I'd say about a year ago or so, I became pretty convinced because of a couple reasons. The first reason was we could see the IP addresses were not type airplane, yeah. They were type residential. So we could filter those out, but even still, we're like, okay, maybe there's something wrong with that. And then we saw, wait a minute, why are all of these listeners who have this high frequency, why are they all Apple Podcasts? If it was Times Square, where are the Spotify listeners at Times Square? But then the third reason that I think was most convincing to me was when we started looking at it with attribution to see maybe 1% of listeners that we think are listeners gets 20% of impressions, but then how many conversions account for them? So then we would see fairly universally that 20%-ish or whatever impressions that are that concentration, they would have extremely poor performance, maybe 2-3% of conversion. So that really made me convinced. So that made maybe a year-ish ago, but I think everybody we would talk to would kind of, it was sort of a hard thing to convey to people, and it wasn't a thing you want to go shouting unless unless you feel fairly confident about it.
Yeah, let's also not downplay the part that you were basically like, this is a new entrant into the attribution space at that point too. So not only are you trying to justify that you're there and why you're there and the value you're bringing. But now you're bringing up something that can negatively affect people's revenue. We have to get our head around it. We need to understand, is this like, and when you first dug into it, it wasn't even clear. Is it a specific show? Is it a network? Is it malicious? And like, to really clarify what we found, right? Like the main issue was resuming auto downloading. So now if you resume auto downloading, it will not download the historical episodes on iOS 17 and forward. The hard part is Apple Podcasts is built into the OS. So until the person updates, this is still an issue. And iOS 17 seems to be slower adoption than everywhere else. Frequency capping does also pay into this. And I want to remind people that like frequency capping is the idea of like saying, I own this combination of IP and user agent over this period of time should only get this many impressions. If I make 1,000 requests for you from that IP and user agent in a minute, the database doesn't have a chance to update. So I respond with all of those like as if they're the same request, right? Because I don't have anything to update to say the ones that I sent were received.
Right.
And then update the counter, right? So you send out 1,000 responses and then they all come back as positive. And then you're like, well, I blew over that by 999. And then you just pause it for the rest of the day for that user or the rest of the campaign. And that one incident there could be devastating, right? And that's the angle that Pete brought up, really highlighted that, right? Like, and this doesn't affect net new episodes. This only affects run of network without frequency cap. And I want to highlight to people that this is still going to be a problem for a while. It's still going to take a bit here. This should not turn you away from that. It should further emphasize why you need to use third-party tools, why you need to make sure your context describes what you're going to build off of, right? How and Pete's numbers and the hosting platform numbers show the same thing when you look at IP and user agent and this frequency here. So I wouldn't push people away from that, but I'd make sure that when they're buyers or agencies, that you're not paying for those extra impressions if you in the contract weren't willing to.
Bryan, I just want to clarify, because you said it's impacting run of network, but I think it's also impacting like any podcast where we buy full catalog. So front and then.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. I mean, anything not episodic. So basically when you're buying full show, full network, so anything dynamically inserted that is more than just 30, 60 or 90-day net new episodes.
Yeah. Got it.
So tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
Miranda, can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen on your end, how you've sort of navigated these conversations in the market, what type of feedback you're hearing?
Yeah, I think Well, I guess first and foremost, right, like with the Apple update, like the way to look at it is like we're trimming the fat, right? We're getting closer to what we're actually paying for. The unique reach stays the same, but it's, a measurement that is more aligned with the truth, which I think everyone, whether you're a buyer or even on the publisher or podcaster, I think everyone can agree and has agreed that is what is fair. And so we are anticipating an improvement in performance because for sure, a portion of those automatic downloads were never actually listened to. I can't tell you how many times like I listen to a podcast, I can't even remember subscribing, but all of a sudden I'm getting alerts that it's like the episodes are downloaded and I haven't listened in the past, year. I couldn't even remember the last time. And so advertisers were on the hook for paying for something that wasn't really there. And to an extent, because of measurement capabilities, they still might be, but this decreases that number. And when we pay for things, when we waste dollars, that equals decreased ROI, right? Which eliminates trust and ultimately deters advertisers from growing or even entering in the space. And I will say, from our perspective, these Pete, what we call like the high concentration, right? Shows that were offenders of this issue. We did see a correlation between performance. And so fortunately, we're in a situation where we have extensive performance history across thousands of different shows. And we use that. We've been using it as a guide. And so for shows where it's particularly bad, because it was impacted by this, the inflation of the numbers, we'd maybe test it once or twice and then we wouldn't retest it again because the performance wasn't there.
I do want to highlight just, and I don't think you meant it like this, but I am incredibly sensitive about these things. None of this was nefarious, right? No publisher could manipulate this or anything like that. And 2 years ago, Apple Podcasts made that addition where after 15 days, if you haven't listened to any of the 5 most recent episodes, your auto download drops off. Does it still notify you? Absolutely. But it doesn't auto download. And I think that what's cool about this is that your performance data that you have on there are a handful of shows that you believed in your heart of hearts should have worked that didn't, that you're going to get to retest now. Right. Yeah. And whether that's, whether some of them, I'm sure some of them you went to integrated or baked in ads and it worked, right? When you moved off of buying their full show, some of them you did dynamic ad insertion, but you paid only for the frequency cap. There's ways around this. The hard part here is just like, it's not done. It hasn't settled. iOS 17, it's going to be over a year.
You mentioned the adoption rates. Sorry, just let me butt in for a sec. They're lower than you anticipated or that we might anticipate based on typical rollouts of these types of things. Like, where do we stand today? How long is it, since it was officially released? And what do we think the prognosis is in terms of, full adoption? When we get to full adoption, what do we think that might mean for download numbers overall for the industry? So that's sort of my extra question.
Well, let's get Pete to jump in on that one.
I think Bryan may have a later update for adoption, but I think it's probably not more than a quarter of people, probably less.
It's a little bit less is what we're hearing.
Have updated. So I think there's a decent way to go, but Giles, one distinction that I would make, maybe publishers might look at from their perspective, how many of my downloads are going to decrease, which I think is one way to look at it. I think another way is, and it's related, but for advertisers, when you're doing a run of show buy, maybe, publisher shows may decrease 15 to 20%, but for advertisers, if they're doing a run of show buy, their concentration, it could be possible it was still a lot even higher than that, just because of the nature of how the ad server was inserting people's ads and back catalog buys. So downloads going, normalizing and decreasing a bit is one thing, but for advertisers, it could even be potentially more of an impact than shows go down, especially if you're doing a lot of the back catalog buys.
We're seeing, I'm hearing low 20%. adoption is what we're seeing, which is really interesting because podcast listeners tend to identify as technology users, early adopters. That's the shtick that we continue to say, and it improves out on surveys. But iOS 17, I believe, has either about a 10 to 15% slower adoption so far than what iOS 16 had. It took iOS 16 about 10 months, is the projections I saw, to hit 80%. But I think that this could be a little bit slower. Now, there's the hard part, right? On a publisher side, like, I don't want publishers' numbers because this is the hard part. How you sell is different than public perception. Your downloads matter because they show up in Podtrack, they show up in Triton, they show up in all these different places where you are ranked appropriately, and that's scary, right? These are the public things that people look at, your investors and everything there. The slower decline, right, and the slower adoption of iOS 17 gives people the ability to focus on organic growth, switch up how they're doing their shows, put effort into paid growth and marketing and all of that, that they could offset it. It could be a year for some of those more hurt publishers where they could just net out at the same numbers by the end of the year, but it's actual reach increase, right? It's more people instead of just more downloads. In the same mindset, advertisers really need to think about how they're buying. I do highly recommend that you put in terms around frequency capping. Whether it can be honored or whether that's reviewed and reduces what you're paying are different stories. And that's where we need to be accommodating on these things, right? If you want to buy all net new and you want it integrated or baked in, that's fine. That's going to be considered a premium, right? You're getting exactly what you want. It believed to be the safest thing. And I think a lot of buyers that want that, I think they understand that that's premium inventory, and that's how it works. If you're willing to try out full catalog and things like that, and you set a frequency cap, usually can get a lower CPM. And you're also in the ability there that you can say, hey, if it exceeds the frequency cap we set, we are not paying for those impressions because they're unlikely to be listened to.
Yeah, Miranda, sorry, just curious from Miranda's perspective, because I know that we have been working on adjusting some of those contracts and trying to, be more firm with our media partners about the frequency issue. Perhaps you could give us just a little bit of a sort of behind the scenes, state of the industry there, Miranda. Like, are we having success with that, and networks honoring it? Like, where are we with it?
Yeah, so what I will say is, since the beginning of the year, more and more partners are able to offer frequency capping. And I think that's just a testament to, Pete and Bryan, the work that you guys have been doing and the noise that we've been making in the market and demands from buyers, because we are seeing that increase, which is great. And it eliminates the need for us to, go to the publishers and try to negotiate, hey, since we can't cap it, we're going to be looking at it and we're going to be monitoring. And if it hits this certain amount, then, those impressions are going to need to be added value. But publishers have generally been open, right? Like there is typically negotiation between, like, what does that frequency number, what does that look like over what period of time? But once we get the, definition down, they've been very collaborative.
I think it's important to highlight that this isn't in a lot of the publishers' hands, by the way. Like, that frequency capping, right. Like I would keep your eyes peeled. There are going to be a few announcements, I think, from some hosting platforms that have really focused on frequency capping that are really exciting, because you know how much you send out, and generally how many of what you send out is usually approved. So you can throttle these things. You can make decisions. If something's frequency cap 1, you probably should stop it at that 1 and then come back and, like, if it doesn't resolve, catch that person later. Oh no, right? Like, you shouldn't take those risks. So we're really excited to see those improvements there. But that's an area that, like, more and more as I get to talk to more and more of the buy side, it's so interesting. Those conversations eat into your time and your capability to improve. Those publishers, like, that are fighting back on it are fighting back because they don't have the tools or anything there. I don't think it's malicious. I don't think it's anything there, but every one of those hours of conversation where it's whether it's a vendor handling it on your behalf, or it's the buyer or agency handling it with the publisher, that reduces efficiency, that decreases ROI, right? So what we need to do is we need to get away from this, either through fixing it, trustworthy third-party tools, or education. We're coming at it all together, and it's happening faster and faster, but those conversations, those arguments need to and I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm saying like those are probably the biggest part of inefficiency in podcasts. And we need to say, these are the numbers, that's what it is, here's the paycheck, and move forward, and then talk about the next campaign and talk about ideating over there, because too many people are telling me they're losing 10, 20 hours a week talking about things like this.
Yeah, it's true. I can't tell you how many times, like when we go to vet something, how many emails back and forth, even just in terms of like, wait, what are you, like the definitions, like what are you calling this? What does that really mean? And how long is it in there for? It is, and I mean, it's incredibly frustrating because we're all, trying to hit deadlines. We're moving fast. We're dealing with a high volume of details that, need to be accurate.
Yeah.
I think one thing to point out too is that there are a number of solutions to this, but at least me and maybe others thought that Apple doing anything was the least likely outcome. So I definitely didn't think that was going to happen. I think it's a testament to Bryan's perseverance, Bryan and others' perseverance in pushing them, that they, did something. But the other options to resolve this, there are a few, and I don't necessarily think, even if the Apple issue is entirely fixed today, I think still there is some of this concentration that happens if you look at buys the same advertiser across publishers. Maybe you're still hitting a small amount of listeners, a decent amount, and it's adding up across publishers. And also to, on streaming, we'll see too, similar, there are cases where the concentration is still there. It might be due to a different reason, but I think the other solutions, such as confirming with publishers that maybe in the invoice terms, we only want to pay for these, I think that's kind of like the near term solution to this that we were looking at more. But I think the ultimate solution is an inventory basically where buyers can determine exactly which impressions they want to buy, and that can set the market rate for downloads versus guidelines is kind of where I ultimately think it may get to.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, we at least need to have a conversation, because Bryan, to your point, like the frequency capping, it is outside of the publisher's hands a lot of times. But the beginning of the year, we were seeing like the hosting platforms did have the capabilities. The publishers, it's just part of their policy to not put a frequency cap on host read campaigns. And so then we start having the conversation, well, okay, well then we're going to start, needing to add this in our terms and conditions when you want to add a buy. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, this is the easier route. We'll just set the frequency capping.
Yeah. And the hard part there is that like our industry has never taken a break. We haven't taken a breather, and like we really need to do that now. Like Sounds Proper literally only exists because we can't slow down to educate ourselves and reevaluate what we've taught people. Like that person, that account manager, senior or junior, that said that to you, that like we don't do that, after you identified that their hosting platform did, it wasn't malicious. It was that nobody taught them how to do it. They weren't set up to ask for it. They didn't know the negative impact of it. The salespersons, the people involved in it, like are not comfortable in anything that limits the maximum potential of what they forecast that could be there. It's a variable and all of that. And it's just so many levels, right? It gets so many levels on there. And so we're working on some guides that show the difference between tech and business case. There's plenty of reasons for business case. When you say you can't do that, well, then the impressions the CPM has to go down, right? Like if I'm the buyer, like we need to remember the buyers are the customers. So if they want to buy a specific way, the buyers, I've never met a buyer that says, I want to buy my specific way and I don't want to pay a premium. They all understand that. If the sellers want to sell them something unique, I think they're like, we'll take a shot, but we're going to pay out our test price, right? We're going to pay at that lower one. And to Pete's point about the billing side of it, it's really the best way to take course here, because it means that we don't have to throw anything out. Because today, right now, like what we were putting together with the IAB, and it's kind of on pause as we see how adoption goes in this, was very hacksaw, right? Like some of the ideas, like you hit a threshold on that user, and then you kind of put that user in timeout, right? Those downloads don't count anymore, or you scramble the ad impressions so everything counts as one, or so many different ideas. But that would have created a level of fragmentation if Apple didn't make this change that I think would have been infinitely more frustrating than looking at potential download dips.
Right, and I think, I know you better not to jump in, Giles, but to the recap, overall, it sounds, maybe on the surface, it may sound a little scary that some of the downloads now are different due to the Apple change, but overall, I think this is actually one of the best things in recent history for podcast advertisers, because performance is getting a lot better now that a chunk of downloads that weren't doing much are largely getting eliminated. And now that I think, due to buyers like Miranda educating and talking to publishers, the need for transparency in the space has never been better understood. So I think ultimately both this leads to greater transparency and trust and performance in the space for buyers.
Yeah, and it gets away from that mindset that DAI and run of network, run a show, back catalog is not as valuable, right? This cleans up some of the problems. I've always thought that was weird, right? If somebody starts 2 years ago on a show and starts listening today, and then starts binge listening, that's a super dedicated person, right? That's got to be valuable. Well, when they were getting caught up with all these other downloads, it was easy to miss that. Now we're getting closer to that, which means DAI and programmatic become more valuable, which means as these estimates on brand advertising increasing in podcasting, we can be more comfortable and confident with that. Because brand advertising can't increase and grow if we don't think performance is working.
Guys, I'm going to start to look to wrap it up. It's been a great conversation, and I actually think that even though we've sort of jumped around a bit, we've answered most of the questions that we had on the agenda here. Perhaps just sort of, and I think you've actually both touched on this, but maybe you have something else to add in terms of, sort of next steps, implications for the industry moving forward. Where else do we need to be shoring up? If there are any other areas that we perhaps suspect that might be worth looking into. Obviously, we've heard a couple of stories over the past 6 months about inflation of audience numbers for one reason or another. Just if you've got any sort of comments about sort of tracking these metrics more accurately moving forward and sort of placing this in the context of the industry as we move forward to sort of perhaps a new stage, just to wrap it up. And that's for anyone and everyone.
Yeah. So the thing that you're talking about with minimum guarantees and inflated numbers, I think that was more ignorance than malicious intent.
Yeah.
I really want to highlight that. I think a lot of the things, if we assume that we have a substantial amount of bad actors, I mean, podcasting is so small still, we're all still friendly. We have several years before it gets cutthroat. We need to 10x before it's really worth fighting with each other. I think that the truth of it is that a lot of it wasn't done maliciously. It's just done by uneducated people. And
I don't mean to imply it was. Sorry.
No. But it's, I think that's really important to focus on, that a lot of these things, we need to just all come together. We need to be able to question things. We need to be comfortable on it, and we need to be on the same page. And that's why, I advocate for the IAB Tech Lab, which is different than IAB US membership, and I encourage people to look into it, because we're about to put in public comment, which is open to everyone, not just IAB members. Public comment for 2.2, the next iteration, and then we're going to move into thinking about 3.0, which will tighten up downloads more. If you're interested in that, you don't need to be a hosting platform, right? I'm part of it. Pete's part of it and is certified as a third-party vendor. There are agencies in there. It's incredibly worthwhile to be there and listen and have those conversations. We have a lot of opportunity to improve this further, but I think the biggest thing is that we need to remember that the download is a stable metric. We are making it better. We have the tools for each buyer to determine what they do and don't want to buy today, and that everybody should be comfortable walking away from buying inventory that they aren't comfortable, that doesn't fit their needs. There's so much podcast inventory out there that if something doesn't pass your sniff test, that people are not servicing you appropriately, it is okay to make that decision that that's not where you want to spend your money.
Yeah. That's great. Anyone else to wrap up? Pete, Miranda?
I would just say I agree with Bryan's assessment that I don't think any of this had anything to do with any bad intent or bad actors. I think it's really a case where it's really hard to know what is happening in the data, and I think it just shows that greater transparency with how the impressions are being delivered benefits everybody in the industry. So I think it has reminded that to everyone. So I think that's really the main takeaway.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll leave it there for this week. Thank you all so much for joining the Media Roundtable. I feel it's been a great discussion. Pete, Bryan, Miranda, thank you all. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain but edify, to build bridges instead of burning them, and to rise above our differences and show that collaboration is possible when we treat each other with respect. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. If you're a marketer looking to align with our vision, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Jennifer, Everett, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.